Here's another thought about President Obama's foreign policy. Sometimes I wonder why people run for president. It's such a tough job. And right now, I think that when he was inaugurated last January 20th, I think he probably assumed the biggest burden since Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated back in March of 1933. I mean, think of the problems that President Obama had placed on his shoulders: the global economic crisis, the worst in 70 years since the Great Depression. And you know, if we're really lucky, and the Dow, I guess, hit 10,000 2 days this week, and it looks like we're climbing out of the recession, we won't experience a depression. But it sure felt last December, January, and February that we might actually get to a depression rather than the Great Recession. He had to assume that responsibility. The worst economic crisis in 70 years. He had to enact the stimulus package. He had to convince Americans that we should spend our way out of the recession, which a lot of people disagree with, but I think was the right thing to do. He had to lead the G20, the leading 20 countries in the world, in international efforts to try to combat the recession and stimulate economic growth. That was just the tip of the iceberg, however. He also, of course, inherited all the challenges that we face right now. The fact we're fighting two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, that's unusual in American history. It's very unusual that we'd be fighting two wars in two different parts of the world. We still have 150,000 troops in Iraq. We can talk about that. How do we get those troops out and diminish bloodshed and try to leave Iraq in a better place than when we found it in March of 2003? That's a tall order. Afghanistan, probably the biggest thing on his mind right now, and you can see this very public review in Washington. Do we have the right strategy? Should we surge? Should we add the number of troops in Afghanistan? Should we not surge? Should we have a counterinsurgency strategy or a counterterrorism strategy? Should we rely on diplomacy or rely on military force? These are big issues. And the president's going to have to make a decision in the next couple of weeks about what to do in Afghanistan. So he had the recession, he had the two wars, two countries, Iran and North Korea, both seeking a nuclear weapons capability, both extremely difficult governments, one in North Asia, the other in the Middle East, critical areas for the United States. What do you do about Iran and North Korea? Do we use military force to stop them? Do we try to negotiate? Do we use incentives? Do we use sanctions? So President Obama has to achieve a balance in what we're trying to do. And on top of all those problems, here's a really interesting thing, especially for the students here. For your generation, he also inherited transnational challenges. These are challenges that are truly affecting every country in the world, that know no boundaries. They're flowing over, under, and through our borders. The Atlantic and Pacific are not protecting us from climate change, from international drug cartels, international crime cartels, from trafficking of women and children, from terrorism, from nuclear proliferation, from the really forbidding, dangerous problem that if the Al-Qaedas of the world, a terrorist group, gets their hands on chemical weapons, or biological weapons, or nuclear suitcase technology, I mean, think of the incredible challenge that poses to democratic societies like our own. So these transnational problems are important, I think, for two compelling reasons. The United States cannot be isolationist in dealing with these problems. Because if we stay out of the international effort to combat them, well, we lose. And we also can't be unilateralist. We can't go it alone, because if you try to go it alone on climate change in one country, it's not going to work. If you try to contain Al-Qaeda or defeat Al-Qaeda in one country, it's not going to work. If you try to combat the inflow of crack cocaine from Colombia into our streets by ourselves, that's not going to work. Or opium from Afghanistan, that's not going to work. To combat trafficking of women, which is a huge problem in all parts of the world, we can't do it alone. This is an interesting lesson for Americans. We're still the most powerful country in the world, but our power is limited. And we need to work with other countries to achieve results. We need to pay attention to our friends and build up our alliances. This is a lesson for those people who, after 9/11 and after Afghanistan, there were a group of people in our country who basically said, you know, we can kind of go it alone. We're the most powerful country. We're the best country. And you know what? It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way, especially on transnational problems. You need to have international cooperation, and the U.S. has to lead in the effort. So he's assumed this massive set of responsibilities. And I'll just focus on one, and then we'll go to questions. I think, we've got to be a global country. We're the world leader. We're also a multinational society. We have people from all over the world who come here as immigrants and live here as citizens. Every one of us comes from a different part of the world. So we've got to be interested in Africa, Europe, Latin America, Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, and certainly in North America where we live. But I think right now you'd have to say that the Middle East and South Asia are probably the regions giving us the greatest number of challenges, and we have to focus there first. Now, if we'd been meeting in any other decade, going back 100 years, I wouldn't have made that statement. If we'd been meeting on October 16, 1999, or 1959, or 1939, or 29, I would have said it's Europe, which is, of all the regions of the world, to the United States, because that's where the critical dangers were to us. You've all read history. In 1917, we went into the First World War. 2 million Americans into the Western Front in Europe. And then we had the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. And we had the Second World War, where 16 million Americans were in uniform around the world fighting that total war. And then we had the 5 decades of the Cold War, from 1945 into the early 1990s. We stationed 300,000 troops in Europe every single day, from the late 1940s to the early 1990s, because we had to defend against a possible Soviet threat to Western Europe. And think what Bill Clinton was doing in the 90s. He had 4 Balkan wars to contend with. And we intervened twice, in Bosnia in 95 and Kosovo in 99, to protect Muslim populations from a Christian Serb army. So from 1917, Woodrow Wilson, to 1999, Bill Clinton, we had to be more about Europe than any other part of the world, because that's where the vital dangers were. And I'm not saying that Latin America, Africa, and even Asia, East Asia, China are not vital. They all are. But in terms of what really hurt our country, vital moral challenges, they're in the Middle East, and they're in South Asia for all the wrong reasons. Let's look at the agenda that Obama has inherited. In the Middle East, we're still in Iraq. He said we're going to take the troops out in 3 years. I think he's right to do it. We've been there for 6 years. We've lost 4,300 men and women in uniform. About 30 to 35,000 Iraqis have been killed. Tens of thousands of people wounded. It's been a horrible conflict. We've done what we can do, I think, to help stabilize Iraq. And we can't be everywhere at once, and we can't fight 2 wars at once. So I think President Obama is right to take us out of Iraq. But when he made that announcement last February, Iraq looked fairly quiet. Since then, it's become more violent. You've seen more suicide bombings. You've seen more inter-ethnic conflict, sectarian conflict among Kurds, Shia, and Sunni. And so it's not going to be easy to get out. And it's not going to be easy to transfer all that power and authority, especially for security that we've been shouldering for 6 years. Second, in the Middle East, the Israelis and Palestinians have had 61.5 years without a peace agreement. Since May 14, 1948, that's the day Israel declared itself independent. It's also the day the Palestinians, many of them, fled their homes, their villages, thinking they would come back, and they haven't come back. So that's 61 years where Israel hasn't had a day of peace. And I would say that the Palestinians have not had a day of justice, because they've not been able to return